This is a download from the BBC. It's from our own correspondent. We make one version of the programme for the BBC World Service, but this is the latest edition broadcast on BBC Radio 4. It's introduced by Kate Adie.
Hello. Today, read all about it, the true heroes of Iraq's years of bloody conflict. It's the Brazilian city with the world's largest slum population, and the battle over housing in Sao Paulo is becoming increasingly political. A question you just can't ask a 16-year-old girl, not even in a remote village in Burma's Irrawaddy Delta. And on the beach in Mauritania, we learn why the language of love is all about fish. The Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki is confident he won enough votes in this week's election to hold on to his post. But it'll be weeks before the results published, and with parties bitterly divided, forming a government could take much longer. April was one of the bloodiest months in the country for years. More than 1,000 people were killed. Kevin Connolly says the way ordinary Iraqis go about their daily business amid the ever-present threat of violence is nothing less than heroic.
The book market in downtown Baghdad is a joyful testament to the durability of the human spirit. The sellers spread their wares out like carpets of all the world's learning, stretching from the covered walkways out into the middle of the pedestrianised street. It is an odd selection. There's a copy of Practical Electronics from the pre-transistor age, a handbook of civil engineering that would take 2 people to lift up, and a book with a picture of the tough but tragic French boxer Marcel Cerdan on the cover. He's the one who dated Edith Piaf and died in a plane crash. On more than one stall you find stacks of Mein Kampf in Arabic, which you can interpret in one of 2 ways. Adolf Hitler either has a disturbingly big print run in these parts, since there are a lot of them, or gratifyingly low sales, since they're still there. There are also a couple of copies of the autobiography of the former Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. The agent who handled his Middle Eastern sales in Arabic must have been quite a negotiator. There are more browsers than buyers, in truth, although I picked up a couple of things myself and was quite tempted by what looked like the Arabic version of an American self-help book called, with engaging directness, Don't Be Sad. I think the English original might have had a slightly more inspirational title. But on your way into the street market, you pass through a 4-man police checkpoint, in which the first officer has the grim job of searching people to make sure they're not wearing a suicide bomber's vest. The first one he finds, of course, will be the last thing he ever finds. And yet, he sets about the task with a kind of brusque courtesy, which is rather impressive in the circumstances. In this baking, dusty, chaotic, friendly city, no warning bomb attacks have become so commonplace that they barely move the needle on the dial of international attention. When you're out and about, there's a curious feeling that sits somewhere near the back of your mind, like a tune that you can't quite remember and can't quite get out of your head. It's not fear exactly, more a heightened awareness of how fragile are the bonds that bind us to life and how easily they are broken. We all know all of that, all of the time, of course. It's why we look before stepping into the road. But for Iraqis, it seems painfully close to the surface of thought, and it never seems to leave for a moment. Nearly 8,000 civilians died here last year, mainly in suicide bombings or other sorts of no-warning attacks that grind down our ability as ordinary people to lead ordinary lives. That's getting on for 3 times the number of people who died on 9/11, and more than double the total number of deaths in the long agony of Northern Ireland's modern troubles. Think for a moment of the devastation and despair left in the wake of the Omagh bombing, which killed 29 people in 1998. How we live to this day with the political, emotional, legal and human fallout from it. In the last few days alone in Iraq, there have been 2 bomb attacks that killed more people than Omagh. In one explosion alone, 50 people died. All those lives lost, and all the lives around and beyond them broken beyond repair. I've no idea if the Baghdad book market might ever be a target, and nor do the people who go there every week. A truckload of explosives was detonated outside the local tea shop a few years ago, killing dozens of people. But that's no reason to believe it won't happen again, or that it will either. It's the uncertainty that eats at everyone's nerves. No solution to any of this seemed to be available in these elections. Iraq, in truth, is drifting dangerously in the uncertain waters of the modern Middle East. Shia fighters leave here to fight for Bashar al-Assad in Syria, but then Sunni fighters come from elsewhere in the Middle East to join the insurgency against Iraq's Shia government in Anbar province. In theory, the bomb attacks support that insurgency here, but in truth, the motive seems to be sectarian hatred and the target, daily life itself, in coffee shops and markets and cafes. Which makes places like the Baghdad book market pretty special. The buyers and the sellers and the saunterers and the schmoozers don't look like they're doing anything exceptional. But there is a kind of heroism to be found in ordinary things done in extraordinary circumstances. Not the kind that wins medals, perhaps, but the kind of fatalistic ability to endure that gets you through a day. Londoners must have known it during the Blitz. Iraq is the kind of place that makes a mockery of optimism. But in the ability of its people to simply keep going, there is surely reason for hope.
And that was Kevin Connolly. Elsewhere in the Middle East, the long-running peace talks between Israelis and Palestinians have, it seems, finally foundered. The U.S. Secretary of State, John Kerry, who spent months trying to close the divide between the two, has conceded it's time for a pause in negotiations. The Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, in a speech in Tel Aviv on Thursday, said he now planned to establish in law Israel's status as the national homeland of the Jewish people. Arab rejection of the Jewish state, he said, was at the heart of the conflict. Earlier, the two rival Palestinian factions, Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, reached a deal they said would bring them back together. Jeremy Bowen's been considering how these developments will affect the long-simmering discontent in the region.
Gaza City has very few open spaces. The beach is the most popular. Many Palestinians in Gaza can't leave the narrow and overcrowded strip because of Israeli and Egyptian restrictions. At the beach they can walk, swim in the Mediterranean, relax a little, and wonder about a much bigger world somewhere beyond the horizon. Another oasis is the Gaza War Cemetery. 3,500 British and Commonwealth dead from the two world wars are buried there, and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission has performed its usual gardening miracle. Among the lines of limestone graves are flat green lawns, trees, and they've created some peace and shade in a dusty, noisy city built on sand dunes. More than 15 years ago, I walked around the cemetery with a Palestinian man in his mid-20s. He told me it was the only place he could think. We were talking because he'd been tortured in a Palestinian jail. His fingernails had been torn out with pliers and had regrown as horny little stumps. He'd been accused of being an activist in Hamas. His torturers were from the Palestinian security forces that were dominated by men from Yasser Arafat's faction, Fatah. The peace process with Israel was still supposed to be moving ahead, and Arafat's people had cracked down hard on Hamas after a series of suicide bombs that had killed dozens of Israelis. Tension, and worse, between Hamas and Fatah has deep roots. So it was no surprise that it led to bloodshed after Hamas won an election in 2006. Palestinians were sick of Fatah's excesses, corruption and ineptitude. Hamas is an acronym for the Arabic words for Islamic Resistance Movement. It's a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, the group that's been working since the late 1920s to put Islam at the heart of political and social life in Muslim countries. The barman in the American colony, the hotel journalists liked to use in Jerusalem, was a Muslim who didn't drink. He said back then that he'd known an electoral upset was coming when Christian Palestinians had told him over their whiskies that they'd be voting for Hamas. Fatah and its allies in the West were aghast about the victory of Hamas. A senior American official told me in his office in the State Department in Washington that the priority was reversing the result. The Americans helped Fatah prepare a coup against the newly elected Hamas government. Hamas moved first, and amid brutal scenes, Hamas fighters unceremoniously ejected Fatah from the positions of power it still held in Gaza. Mohammed Dakhlan was the Fatah strongman in Gaza, someone the Americans relied on. His men had rounded up and tortured Hamas sympathizers in the 1990s, including the man I'd met in the British graveyard. I talked with Dahlan in his office not many months before I saw TV pictures of exultant Hamas fighters smashing it up and firing their Kalashnikovs into his desk. He had escaped. Since then, the Palestinians have been divided, with Hamas in power in Gaza and Fatah in the West Bank. I use the term in power advisedly. Israel is really in control in the West Bank, and even though its troops and settlers were pulled out of Gaza 9 years ago, it can still blockade the Gaza Strip in a way that is at times devastating for civilians. People in Gaza, in different ways, relied on tunnels dug into Egypt for everything from Coca-Cola to weapons. Some tunnels were big enough to drive in cars and live animals. When the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas's allies, won the election in Egypt, Hamas was flying high. But now the Egyptian military says it's destroyed more than 1,300 tunnels since it seized power last year. Hamas was running out of options. One it had left was ending the split with President Mahmoud Abbas of Fatah. His side had concluded that the latest round of talks with Israel was going nowhere, like all the others over 20 years or more. So unity seems to be part of a new strategy for President